Hey everybody, welcome to Sweater Weather, a podcast about stories. I'm Aaron.
I'm Naomi.
How are you doing today, Naomi?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah, pretty good.
Hanging in?
Hanging in there. Do you want to give a writing update? Or is this a thing? I was thinking this would be a normal segment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sad to say that I haven't been writing still, so.
But that's not true.
I've been working on a ghostwriting project.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's coming along nicely.
Yeah.
But that's not mine. That's someone else's.
Yeah. I think it's fair to mention it, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's all part of the writing life.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And editing, I'm working with other people on their writing. So basically, right now, my writing life is assisting others with their writing, which is actually something I very much enjoy.
Wonderful. Wonderful, yeah.
And yourself?
I've had a challenging week just getting my requisite words in there. I try to do some every day, but it's a kind of a busy time of year at school. And so I've only been able to get a couple of thousand words on the first draft of my new novel. So I would say like as far as the first draft goes, this is like 5%, 5% done. So okay, it's something. It's good. It feels good. It's fun when I go to it. It's really fun to go to it. I'm trying to write something comic, and it's like I'm making myself laugh, which maybe that's a little sad.
Well, it's a good sign.
But I'm enjoying it. We'll see.
It's definitely a good sign.
Well, it is what it is. So that's my writing update. So
would you say that your novel you're working on might be the great Canadian novel?
I mean, I'd love it to be, right? I mean, that is on my mind these days. It's incredibly presumptuous to say that out loud, though. Thanks for making me say it.
Well, we had talked about perhaps that our topic today would be
the great Canadian novel. And I pitched this idea, and you seemed lukewarm, but then was like, all right.
Well, I realized that I never really understood what people meant.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk about the great American novel more.
Yeah.
And then I actually went and read a couple of things about it. So I was like, what do people even mean when they say that? Do they mean the greatest novel in the history of that country? No, that's not what they mean.
They don't mean that.
They mean a novel that uniquely and somehow once and for all captures the essence of the nationhood of that country.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's a little bit easier to start talking about the great American novel. In fact, I've not really heard the phrase applied to any other country.
Well, I did find a couple of articles that talked about the great Canadian novel. And basically there was one in the Walrus in 2017 by a fellow called Andre Forget, I guess.
Yes, I'm familiar.
And is he a critic or a writer?
Yeah, critic I know him as, but yeah.
And then Russell Smith, who wrote a column in the Globe and Mail about books.
A long-time critic there.
Yeah.
Culture critic.
Like shortly thereafter, in 2018, wrote a response, basically. To Andre.
Okay, this was an exchange between Forget and Smith.
Yeah, pretty much.
And what did they say?
So Forget was talking about how, like, basically lamenting the lack of great attempts at great Canadian novels and how, like, we don't attempt that the way American writers do. And then Smith was responding that this is just to sum up, like, in the shortest number of words, that in fact, if anyone was going to be able to do that in Canada, it would be a Quebecois writer writing in French.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because of their stronger sense of nationhood? Okay. That's interesting.
And because he was saying that, like, the way that he described what a novel like that would have to be. I mean, so Andre Forget talks about, like, the social novel or the novel of society of the 19th century. Okay. Like Middlemarch, for instance. There's other examples that are slipping from my mind. I'd read them all, but now I can't remember what they are, the examples he gave. But like Anna Karenina, of course, not American, but like where it's kind of trying to show kind of the aristocracy or the ruling class, and then also different classes. So like showing all the different people, like kinds of people in a society and how they're all interacting, and so Russell Smith was talking about, for a great Canadian novel to be that worthy of that name, that it would have to be about, at least to some degree, the movers and shakers, the leaders, the rich people, the people that make things happen. and that Canadians don't like to write about that we like to write about the downtrodden and marginalized.
Okay.
That's why we end up writing domestic literature rather than literature about like a dynastic family or something like that. I mean, one exception was like that I think they both mentioned is Solomon Gursky was here, which is by Mordecai Richler, and I guess is a thinly veiled novel about the Bronfmans. And so that kind of thing, although I don't think it talks about, like, it's just about them. It's not about like all the different parts of society, right? So I haven't read it. I've read a lot of his books, but not that one. But if I'm understanding correctly, it's like a Succession kind of story, like about a family with a lot of power, not about.
Yeah, I've read it. I read it a while ago.
Right. And so like, I mean, but then like books like Huckleberry Finn are often cited as like the great American novel. And that's certainly not about like the leading class or the ruling classes. So, I mean,
well, but that was about a central question to American society, race relations. Yeah.
But I
slavery
mean,
and all that.
but like what they say is like, well, you can't get more American than this kind of thing.
Right. It depends on how you're defining American, right?
And so, I mean, it also obviously depends on how you're defining the great like American or Canadian novel. And like Andre Forget talks about, now I've read this too, and now it's going to slip my mind, but the book that won the Booker about like the death of Bob Marley and how it's about all these different segments and people in Jamaican society.
It's Marlon James?
Yeah, Marlon James. And basically about how that's like the great Jamaican novel.
Okay.
And it like it doesn't shy away from like big, dramatic, exciting events and people that like affect the entire country. And that like for some reason in Canada, we write as though like our country is like small and boring and nothing happens here.
Okay.
I would so there. That's what I.
Okay.
In my very brief like thinking about this, that's what I've come across. And then also, I mean, the complaint being like another level of this that they mention is that like how we don't have a strong sense of nationhood the way that Americans do, maybe, and that that being like, especially now, and like the whole question of cultural assimilation and who gets to tell the story of who's Canadian and what Canadian is, and like, is it even something to be proud of to be Canadian, is something that like we're more ambivalent about, like even if it's a good thing to be Canadian, or like, you know, quite apart from like what is it to be Canadian, who gets to say they're Canadian, and all of this puts a damper on our ability. Like we don't have the kind of rah we're American thing that
except right now.
But right now we do, which is interesting.
Just kind of one reason why thinking about this question now too. One thing you said about, just going back, this is a smaller point maybe, the disinclination of Canadian writers to write about, you said, the rich and the powerful.
Yeah.
I have to say there's honestly a litigious issue here, where Canada does not have the same guaranteed speech rights as the United States. So I have oftentimes in the last few years considered writing about public figures in a fictionalized way. And I've realized it's actually very touchy. And I think publishers would be scared to publish it. And I would be, quite frankly, scared to publish it too, because of we don't have the same guaranteed speech rights about these things in Canada. So that would be one thing I'd be worried about a little bit about even, I know like Mordecai Richler got away with it, but it was a different time. He was a different kind of writer. And
so another thing that Andre Forget says is that,
and also it was like it was defensible that it wasn't about the Bronfmans.
Right. You can just say no. Yeah. But he says that, you know, it doesn't count if something's so long ago, talking about a time so long ago, that there's no one left to get angry or offended.
That's true. Yeah. Well, no, not in Canada. Again, this is not true, because descendants who can claim that a critique of one of their forebears affects them negatively now, and if they're rich,
what are you saying? It doesn't count as the great Canadian novel, like for instance, how like Wayne Johnston writes about Newfoundland and like the story of Joey Smallwood, fictionalized. That he's like, that's not good enough, or that's not the great Canadian novel, because that's a different, like that's a Canada of long ago, and there's no one left to have any stakes. This
is a thing, and that's too regional. I mean, I actually don't agree with the point about Quebec, except that yes, the strong sense of nationhood for sure, but anything that was just about Quebec is just going to be too regional, just like anything that's just about Joyce Smallwood of Newfoundland is going to be too regional. Like
but
you can
isn't that
tell,
true in America too? Like, isn't Huckleberry Finn regional? Like, it's totally
but
regional.
but sometimes the region can somehow be stand in for the greater Canada. I just think
Maybe in Canada it can't. Like,
well,
maybe
it
that's
has
part
no,
of.
but it has. I mean, it has. Like it often has. So like in pop culture, the hoser archetype of the beer drinking Mackenzie brothers, or of like Red Green, or of Letterkenny, and okay, Trailer Park Boys was like charmingly like the East Coast as well. So sometimes the regionalism of the Trailer Park Boys was more obvious, and sometimes it was less obvious. I think they were more of a class, standing for a certain class of Canadian. I think often Ontario, everything outside of the city in Ontario, like north of Toronto or whatever, west of Toronto, like everything around the metropolis of Toronto has often been a stand-in for some version of what's supposed to be Canada, like kind of more, a little bit more suburban, also a little bit more rural, right?
But
like
all
kind
of these are
excerpt.
examples of stories about the domestic, downtrodden, like the
These are middle
people
class
without power.
I think these are essentially projections of middle class imagination. Like,
But they're not about the people who control the country and the direction.
no,
the society.
no. I'm agreeing with that point.
Yeah.
That you can't actually in Canada. There's a reason why people don't write about that, and it may have to do with legal concerns. So you would gravitate to other kinds of stories about other kinds of people. But I do think in terms of regions, I think once we used to live in Ontario, we grew up in Ontario. When we moved elsewhere, we realized, how regional a certain version of Canada really was to Ontario.
Absolutely.
So,
and how and like Ontarians, especially Torontonians, just think, well, yeah, this is Canada. Like Toronto is like a metonym for all of Canada. And it's absolutely not.
I mean, there's the urban and the rural.
Yes.
And so the rural has often been, so like some version of the rural, the wild, the people who inhabit that, or the exurbs.
The Ontario rural,
That has often been Canada. Small town Ontario.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And in literature like the Alice Munros, the Margaret Atwoods, like that's all both urban and rural Ontario.
I feel like I grew up in the heart of Canada because it's small town Ontario.
Yeah.
That's kind of often how I unconsciously thought.
I mean, I grew up in urban Ontario, so a different thing.
Yeah.
And where maybe it feels a little bit less like distinct from America or whatever, like it feels.
I don't know. I mean, that's the next question. Do we want to broach that topic? How much of Canadian anything is about not being American? It's kind of an anti-Americanism sometimes, and it's more vulgar forms. Like we've definitely been seeing that now. Like
now that Trump is like claiming that he wants to take us over, and that he's now putting these tariffs on us.
I know, already taking them off, but anyway, yeah.
No, they're back on.
No, they're back off.
No, they're on.
When's the last?
Yesterday.
Okay, this morning they're probably coming off again. It's just the silly. I have no idea.
Anyway, whatever. Yeah. Like the fact that Trump is like somehow is very much putting our backs up.
Mm-hmm.
Now all of a sudden we're like, no, we're Canada, and especially the whole like you're going to be American thing, and like why wouldn't you want to be American? You're just some stupid little town up north.
From an American POV, sometimes.
Right, and that perspective is what's we're always insisted that we're not American. We travel with our like Canadian flag stuck to our bags or whatever, and and I mean it's interesting to me because I came to this from a like slightly different angle in that I grew up. Well, I was born in England, then started to grow up in Washington, D.C., and then moved to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So when I moved to Canada, I found out, much to my surprise, that Canadians didn't like Americans.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
like I didn't even know what Canada was. I was 7, to be fair.
It's often a surprise to Americans.
Yeah, and then at one point I was working on a project that never came to fruition about Americans who moved to Canada, and the history of that, and the phenomenon of Americans saying they're going to move to Canada. And I interviewed a bunch of Americans who'd moved to Canada, and a lot of them said they were truly shocked that Canadians weren't just kind of in awe and like wishing they could be American.
Even though they chose to move to Canada for, I'm sure, good reason.
Well, a lot of them chose to move to Canada just because they married a Canadian or for a job. Like it wasn't because they were like, I'm out of here.
Right. There have been lots of times when people like,
and people have done that. And there is this like also like mythos around Canada in America, where they're like, oh, that's where you go when you're trying to not fight in a war, or when you don't like who's president, or
the more liberal. Well, you don't like the Republican president. It's
yes.
it's in the American liberal imagination, it's some kind of a safe haven.
Yeah, like if there's an immoral war or an immoral president, if America's being immoral, you can move to Canada because Canada's guaranteed to be moral.
Yes,
that's a better way of putting it.
I mean, this is the fiction.
That's the fiction.
Yes, we're not endorsing this as a view.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
So that's interesting how Americans see us, how we see them, and then how we see ourselves in relation to them. And it is this weird kind of, I mean, obviously this happens in other parts of the world, like New Zealand and Australia, Scotland and England, like where you're just like, we're not them. And this is like, because you're so vociferously not them, like being not them becomes so much of your identity that you're associated with them more than anything else.
And when you are the world hegemon or a regional power, like that's a question you don't think of very much, because you just see yourself everywhere else. Like you see your culture projected.
Yeah, like why would you care what this little weenie up north thinks?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, Americans really, I mean, from what I learned interviewing people, is they were like, no, we really, you know, when a friend of mine was like, I was really raised to think everyone else in the world just wishes they could be American. And they think everyone loves them. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's bring this question around to the novels again. So you've mentioned a few examples of what could be the great American novel. This is again, you know, it's so funny, the contradictions here when even just talking about the stuff like coming to the question of the great Canadian novel. We're actually starting with the question of the great American novel.
Yeah, we're doing
because
it.
this is so much of, I mean, it's impossible.
Well, they're the ones that invented the phrase, the great whatever novel.
Right. So you mentioned Huckleberry Finn as an example. You know, for me, what jumps to mind is The Great Gatsby, maybe because it has the great right in the name, but it is like a story of a upward, like the American dream, like the story of the American dream, somebody trying to like will themselves, kind of lie themselves into a higher status. As you know, by also getting rich. So
that's true.
I think there's a lot of and I think the popularity of that novel, the accessibility of the novel, the fact that it's so short and it's so widely taught. But I mean, that goes for Huckleberry Finn as well. But then there's, in terms of how widely it's taught in schools and stuff. Then the other thing I was thinking of for the great American novel would have been The Catcher in the Rye, a book I've never read. But again, is it about a quintessential American experience in some way, about like an individual trying to like buck the trend and be himself and being? You don't think so?
I don't see it as a great American. Like it's about
but it's like
disenfranchised youth.
Yeah, but it's like but the fact that it's maybe the most widely read American novel? Yeah,
if that's what makes it the great American novel.
I think that should be a big part of it. Of this discussion.
Maybe at the time it was really like encapsulating a certain American youth alienation.
I
and
think
it's like kind of about being, it captured something that was American. It's just, if you're talking about like, you have to capture kind of the essence, the entirety of how that country's functioning at that time. Like it doesn't do that.
Well, I don't know how else to judge something being widely interesting, capturing the essence of the public, except in one way by its popularity, about how widely read it really was and how much of a cultural touchstone it's become because people know
the Catcher in Rye.
So I don't think you can talk about the great any country novel if you're not taking into account its popularity.
Sure, but I mean, maybe its popularity is necessary but not sufficient, you know?
Sure, yeah, sure.
Because like, it's certainly not an Anna Karenina or a Middlemarch.
Well, I mean, that's telling of what Americans' culture is at mid-century too. It's not a grand social tapestry. It's an individual making his way and trying to be unique, and like that's, you know, I mean, there was another.
But it's more like the David Foster Wallace's, the Jonathan Franzen's, who was I gonna say? Like who else is it? Just slipped my mind. Like those big sprawling.
Yeah, the family. Well, I mean, you know, the family epic, the Jonathan Franzen family epic. insofar as a family can be a stand-in for America somehow.
But they're all kind of touching, making contact with different parts of society and being influenced in different ways and having different experiences, coming back together.
Yeah.
I'm not arguing that any of them like capture what it is to be American. Oh, Don DeLillo.
Yeah, I mean, these are all white.
Tries to,
and we're talking about white authors, obviously.
But like Infinite Jest is a book that is frequently cited as like, maybe that's the...
Yeah. I mean, people talk about it. Not many people have really read all the way. I've tried to read it twice, and I was like, nope.
I've read parts of it. I read the beginning.
I'm sorry. I think I have to disqualify a book that people don't actually finish for the most part. I have to do that in my mind. So if we're coming back to the great Canadian novel, do you have any ideas for what you would consider according to your criteria?
I mean, I don't know. Like, I haven't said what my criteria
obviously
are.
We don't know
I'm just
anything.
trying to like figure out what criteria.
This is just spitballing. We don't know anything. This is not getting written down anywhere.
Like I think at some point I would have said Margaret Laurence, like maybe The Diviners.
The Diviners. Okay, why is that?
Well, it's about small town Manitoba.
Okay.
It could be small town kind of anywhere.
Yeah.
Kind of. It's about a woman who does have a very long, sprawling life. So it's a long kind of, I don't know if epic's the right word, but throughout this woman, it's her whole life and her meeting different people, having a lot of contact with different actors in society, including like the kind of marginalized Indigenous family in her town, and the son of which becomes her lover, and they have a daughter together. And then she's raising her half Indigenous daughter as a single mother, and so it touches on kind of the most impoverished and marginalized family in her town, which was like kind of typical. And they become part of the story, and then she also like becomes a writer and has like ends up marrying a professor at one point. So she does like, so it has more of a moves to Toronto, so she moves around Canada kind of like being part of different parts of society.
Okay, so there's more of a social tapestry as well as different regions in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm just articulating as I'm saying it why I might think. And so there's like a real Canadian ethos and like, sorry to say this word, but vibe to it, the same way as there is in like Bear by Marian Engel or like Alice Munro.
We're not putting forward Bear as the great Canadian novel.
But, and like, as well as having that kind of sort of gentle, introspective Canadian touch, there are kind of big, exciting things happening as well. I mean, not like at the level of like government. She doesn't like become prime minister or anything, but or Bronfman, you know.
Okay.
But
so that would be your choice.
Well, I mean, I think it's a contender.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Although, I mean, like, has nothing been written since that is like more relevant in the meantime? I mean, obviously.
It came out in the 70s?
Or
early 80s? When is that from?
70s or early 80s. I don't remember the exact year. And then, you know, if you look up like lists of like the greatest Canadian novels, there's a lot on there that I agree is great. Like novels by Richard Wagamese.
Yeah.
Like, I do think those are among the best Canadian novels ever, but like, are they the like Canadian novel?
Right. In terms of like the favorite Canadian novels you've read, like I like Green Grass, Running Water a lot by Tom King. And there's something very, it feels like.
Yeah, that's on all the lists too.
Sure.
Or like Obasan by Joy Kagawa.
Sure.
Like these capture really important things about Canada.
Yeah.
Really like important phenomena and like social phenomena and like parts of society.
Yeah.
But do they capture the whole thing? Like, of course not, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's in a way, it's a futile effort, but we still want to talk about it. So,
but they don't even try to, is what I'm saying. Like, that's not the point of them. So,
to me, like, okay, can I offer? Do you have anything else?
Robertson Davies is another one that comes up as like a contender, Fifth Business.
Yeah, it feels like like there is a social, there's a kind of social tapestry in that novel too, but it feels like of another era. As well, like,
but it was of the era in which it was written, so it's kind of like.
Well, it was already nostalgic, because it was from the 70s, right? And it's kind of depicting the 20s and the 30s,
right? Like the childhood of the author.
Yeah. So I liked reading that book a lot because I felt like this was a look into the middle class, like the Ontario small town middle class of another time, and but like I had relatives that I could think of. Yeah, is that what it was like for my grandfather, kind of thing, growing up, or? his family.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess for me, I'm thinking of The Diviners as a book where like I didn't grow up with Canadian parents, and I didn't fully grow up in Canada, and I didn't really like have an intuitive grasp on what it meant to be Canadian for a very long time, right? Like, it was like, oh, well, like we're British, we're American, we're this, we're that. Like we did not really believe that we were Canadian or feel Canadian, right?
Yeah.
Until like now I do, because I've lived here for a long time and I've just like absorbed the Canadianness of being here. But so for me, like reading books like that was like, oh, is that what Canadian is? You know, like I was learning from it. I wasn't just seeing my reality reflected. I was like, oh, that is that something, you know, that's what's going on here.
Okay.
So I, like those are books that made me feel like Margaret Lawrence's books, and maybe to an extent Robertson Davies's books, which were books I read in school. Like I felt like they were helping me understand what Canada was.
Okay. Yeah. I wonder what books are being taught in high school right now. If there's a serious chunk of Canadian literature there. I'm not sure. I got a good dose of it, but that was in the 90s. It was a higher moment. Like it was a moment of higher nationalism. Like people were more nationalistic. And I think there was still, I don't know. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't know.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was Green Grass, Running Water, Obasan, Indian Horse, like the books that we've mentioned, you know?
Yeah, partly anyway. I would let me just put forth my choice for the great Canadian novel. It's probably pretty obvious. I would say The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And it's kind of, maybe it's a strange choice because it doesn't really take place in Canada. But I mean, to me, there's really nothing more Canadian than the Canadian. But the Margaret Atwood is like the greatest, probably the most famous, the richest, the most successful Canadian author of her generation, probably living, right? So that it's from an iconic Canadian writer. The fact that it takes place in the United States mostly, but in that imagination, Canada is this elsewhere, this like northern liberal haven. And that is so central to Canada's conception of itself too. I mean, I know that there's we talked about the American liberal imagination, what Canada serves there. I do think that gets reflected back to us, and we like to see that version of ourselves.
But wait a minute, is that in the novel or the TV show?
In the TV show, I know there's some scenes anyway. Well, I haven't seen the entire TV show.
It's definitely in the TV show. I'm just not sure if it's in the novel. It's just
talked about.
Okay.
I don't know if there's any, I think it's talked about as an escape, as a possible escape. And I'm not sure if the main character actually makes it there.
She doesn't.
Right.
Sure,
I think, because it's a kind of tragedy, right?
Yeah.
So the tragedy is that she couldn't make it to Canada.
I'm not sure. I think at the end you do see her escape, but you don't know where she's going.
It's an inconclusive ending.
Yeah,
right,
so you don't know if she makes it or where she goes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that it's actually the fact that it was popular in the United States, which is the way that we ultimately judge our success in Canada, is if you were popular in the United States. The fact that it has a American liberal depiction of Canada, to me, is like very Canadian, that we accept
hilarious.
That. And it's also the most popular Canadian book probably of the last several decades. I mean, how many times has it been on the bestsellers list, coming back strongly when the series started in 2016? And since Trump's last election, it's been back. It came back to the New York Times bestsellers again. So I doubt there's a Canadian novel that sold more than that in a long time. So that's what I think. And I think it's a great book. I mean, I like that book a lot. I really enjoyed reading it. And so I think it's a very Canadian book.
Interesting. I just want to say one more thing, like that I really think, and this is after thinking about this only for a couple of hours, so I definitely could be wrong, that Canada, like having lived in a lot of parts of Canada, I definitely don't feel like we're very coherent. Like I feel like there could be like a great Newfoundland novel, a great like Toronto novel, a great Quebec novel, a great BC novel. Like I don't Alberta.
Yeah, the great
I don't prairies, Rockies. Like there's so many cultures in Canada that, I mean, you might as well be in a different country. When you move to moving from, which I did, from the Maritimes to Alberta, might as well be in a different country.
I don't know.
I mean, we speak the same language, kind of, more or less. The culture is really different.
Sure. Yeah, no, there are major differences for sure. I mean,
and I don't know how a novel could capture like Quebec, the Maritimes, Newfoundland, Alberta, BC, the prairie provinces. Like, I just don't see how.
Yeah, Margaret Atwood is an Ontario writer too. So as I
Yeah.
said, like kind of the fallback Canadianness of Ontario.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I would go with that too, I suppose. Yeah, it would be very hard. I mean, this is a classic question of Canadian culture, Canadian literature, the regionalisms, and it's something that, yeah, we've definitely experienced. Yeah, but I have to say, I have actually, like, as an adult, tried to live in other countries where they speak a different language.
Sure, and that's a whole
vastly different economies and political systems and social mores, and that is way different than more different than like going from Ontario to Alberta
yeah, but let
or
me
BC.
Just say, like, I moved from, like, I know I was a little kid, but I moved from England to the United States to Canada to different parts of Canada. Mm-hmm. And specifically from London to Washington, D.C., suburb of Washington, D.C. and Maryland to different parts of Canada.
Yeah.
And they all speak English.
Yeah, that's
important.
And
like, I am not convinced that different parts of Canada are less different than Washington, D.C. and Toronto, or than Washington, D.C. and London and Calgary and Montreal, for instance. Like, they all speak English.
Sure.
And they're all vastly different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my contention, which I might regret saying.
Yeah, I think those are valid differences. I think, like, ultimately the biggest difference in our culture, like in most cultures in North America and Western Europe, is the distinction between urban and rural. Mm-hmm. And then the suburbs often are.
Yes, they're on.
Yeah, I just feel like there's a suburban Canada and there's an urban Canada and there's a rural Canada. So, like, and those are spread out in different ways.
Right. But are the American suburbs that different from the Canadian suburbs?
Well,
that's another question.
This is always, not really.
Yeah.
Like, in a lot of ways, some ways yes, some ways no. Mm-hmm. Yes. Anyway, it's a long standing question, but it's more valid now than it has been in a long time, I think. So yeah. It's funny to come back to this question again after not thinking about it for a while. Mm-hmm. So anyway, thanks for talking about the great Canadian novel with me, whatever that may be.
Yeah, thanks for making me think about it.
Okay. Anything you want to say?
I hope that one of us writes the great Canadian novel.
Giving her a go.
Giving her a go.
Gonna give her a go. Okay. Talk to you later, everyone. Bye.
Bye.